welcome to the Tool Farm Expert Series on Trapcode Form. I'm your host, Harry J. Frank. This first lesson is going to cover the basics of Trapcode Form. We'll go into base form settings and cover how the fractal field can affect our particles in Trapcode Form. We'll discover how to flow this fractal field over time, change our particle color, and then change the shape of our form using something called the spherical field. So first, let's create a new solid. We'll call this form and apply Trapcode Form to the solid. Let's also create a camera for our scene. I'm going to use a 35mm preset. Now if I select the form layer, we can see all of the settings that we got available to us in Trapcode Form. And I'm not going to lie to you, there's a lot of them. But let's keep focused and work on this basic fractal shape. Now I'm using the Orbit Camera tool, and if I rotate around, we can see that we've got 3 boxes in Z. Now if I go to my base form settings, we can see that I've got particles in Z set to 3. If I set this to 2, we'll see 2 boxes, and if I set this to 1, we'll see 1. Now the size in X, Y, and Z are pretty straightforward. If I turn up the size in X or Y, these will get bigger or smaller depending on how I set them. If I adjust the size Z with only one set of particles in Z, we won't see any effect. We need to have at least 2 particles in Z for this size Z to have any effect. I'm going to stick with 2 particles in Z for this basic fractal shape. Now let's rotate around and close up this base form, and let's go down to this fractal field. Now the fractal field is something that you can kind of think of like the standard After Effects fractal noise plugin. It's an evolving fractal noise shape based on some very complex stuff that many of us really don't have any grasp of whatsoever, but we just know that it's sort of this noisy shape that happens through some sort of mathematical process. Now, in Trapcode Form, this is sort of like that fractal noise I just showed you, but it's actually in 4 dimensions. So not only do we have this in X and Y, but we have it in Z when you have it evolving over time. So mostly what we're going to control with our fractal field is not necessarily the shape of the fractal or anything like that, but we're going to define how the particles are affected by this fractal field that is moving through this shape. So if I go into this fractal field and I say that these particles are affected by this 4-dimensional fractal, we can sort of see the shape of this fractal by the distortion that's happening to the size of the particles. If I play this, we can see this shape evolving over time. If I say that the particle opacity should be affected by form, we'll see that the particle opacity is evolving over time. It's different in X, Y, and Z. However, what really gets interesting is when we have the particle X, Y, and Z position, or its displacement change over time. If I change this now, we can see how the fractal field is evolving over time and pushing each of the particles in X, Y, and Z. This is where it starts getting really cool. Now the reason that this fractal is changing over time is because this flow evolution is defaulting to 50. So this is sort of a rate that the fractal will evolve over time. If I set this to 0 and I play this, the fractal will be static. However, I've got other controls here like flow in Y, or flow in X, or flow in Z. These make the fractal flow in the specific direction that we would like it to go. So a quick word on what we're seeing here. Trapcode Form creates imagery by using particles, just like particular if you've ever used it. These particle types are defined over here. These could be a standard sphere or a glow sphere or cloudlet or even custom particles. But it's important to remember that Trapcode Form is a particle generator. The critical difference between Trapcode Form and something like particular is that the particles in Form never die. In fact, they never are born and they never die. They're always there. These particles that make up the Trapcode Form shape are always there. So when we see this image here that is starting to look pretty good, but it looks kind of like, well, just a bunch of dots. So let's smooth this image out by creating more particles in the X and Y axis. So I'm going to turn this up to maybe 200 particles in X. Now notice it's smoother in X. We have these more finely defined lines that go across here. But in the Y-axis, it's still a little steppy. So let's turn this up even more until we get a smooth shape. It's starting to get there. Let's set this to 300. Now let's change this color so it's not white. Let's make it kind of a nice orange. Looks just fine. Now notice what's happening with the particle interaction. We have these nice color highlights happening where the particles intersect, and that is because the transfer mode defaults to add. We can set it to something else like normal, which is going to look pretty flat. Let's leave it on add. Now if we play this, this is still flowing in the negative X direction using this fractal field that is affecting the displacement of each of the particles that Trapcode Form is generating. Now let's affect this shape just a little bit more. If I close up this fractal field and the base form and the particle settings, we have this spherical field that we have control of. In fact, there are two settings in here called Sphere 1 and Sphere 2. What these are spherical areas of displacement that we can define. This is, again, very similar to particular if you've ever used it. What I'm going to do is turn up the strength to 100 and turn the radius up to 200. Now what we've got is a spherical area that will displace the particles if this strength is set to a positive number. Now I can visualize this a little bit better by clicking this box that says Visualize Field. This will create a red area for this displacement area. So if I move this spherical field over to the left, we'll see that we've got this spherical area now that is pushing the particles out of the way. If I set this strength to a negative value, the sphere will turn blue, and you'll notice that the particles are being attracted to this area. So if I set this strength back to 100, I can adjust this spherical shape to push all these particles out of the way. So what I need to do is push this a little bit in the Z-axis, and I'll go in and I'll change this base form shape so that the size in Z isn't quite as large. Now I can also move the center of the base form around, like so. And what you need to understand is that this base form up here at the top is way upstream from all the distortion and displacement that is happening to it. So as we move the base form, that base shape is then being affected by the fractal field, which is then being affected by the spherical field. You really should think of this as sort of a top-down calculation, because the base form is always calculated first and then everything kind of happens after that. So let's turn this Visualize Field off and take a look at what we've got here. We've got a nice flowing fractal field with a little bit of notch pushed out of the way for, well, whatever you want. Text, logo, you name it. Now, let me point out one very brilliant thing that was added to Trapcode Form. If we go into the fractal field here, we have got this option here to select Flow Loop. What's going to happen is that this cycling evolution in our fractal field that's affecting our particle displacement in this case is now going to loop, and it's going to loop in the time that we specify right here in the loop time. So over the course of 5 seconds now in this composition, this fractal is going to seamlessly loop. And I think very few of us are ever going to really appreciate how complicated this was to achieve, but what I can say is that it's a very, very cool feature. For us to be able to make seamless loops with fractal field distortion is pretty amazing.